Break the chains. Abolitionism is a movement to end slavery. The abolitionism movement began in the 18th century, and we carried it into the 19th century. The majority of abolitionists are religious white people who are against immoral part of history. We dream to abolish and finally put a close to slavery. Our philosophy is everyone should have an equal and free life. Using humans as property or animals should never be anyone's lives. We believe that Africans deserve all rights that whites have.
So there's a lot of evidence that prove how cruel the treatment was to the slaves, and their conditions and our conditions were awful, and we had to go through a lot. So I'm Frederick Douglass, and I'm an escaped slave who became an author, a public speaker, a prominent activist, and a very successful man. In my narrative, which was called Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, is written to help familiarize the public with how gruesome slavery really is. And some quotes from my narrative are, "For my part, I should prefer death to hopeless bondage." And this is just me talking about how terrible the act of slavery was, and how it led many people, including myself, to lose all hope, to where we would rather just die than keep going. And in our eyes, this lifestyle was just hopeless. And then another quote from my narrative is, "I remember the first time I ever witnessed this horrible exhibition. I was quite a child, but I well remember it. I never shall forget it whilst I remember anything. It was the first of a long series of such outrages, of which I was doomed to be a witness and a participant. It struck me with awful force. It was with blood-stained gait the entrance to the hell of slavery through which I was about to pass. It was a most terrible spectacle. I wish I could commit to paper the feelings with which I beheld it." And this was just basically me talking about how when I was young, I watched my aunt get beaten in front of me, and it led me to wonder what was next for me, and it made me realize that later in my adult years that I would experience this for the first time. And I just saw the injustice and cruelty, and I would never forget it.
My name is William Lloyd Garrison, and more evidence is pictures and drawings that we have collected. The first one is showing how slaves were auctioned off, and it's just cool how people treat slaves like property or animals and auction them in an actual stage. And then the second picture is a picture of a slave named Thomas Johnson, and he's showing how he is beaten by slave owners and how torturous it was. And then the last is a drawing of what my people do to slaves, which is what we are trying to stop, and how plantation is backbreaking labor.
Okay, so we're just going to start talking about some of the leaders. And so here are some leaders that are four of us, and they're both men and women of both races who show true characteristics of someone who sees something that they don't like and fight for change. And some, including myself, escape slavery, beat the odds, and even risk their lives for something they truly believed in. So myself, Frederick Douglass, as I said before, I was a slave, and I worked on plantations for the majority of my life. I eventually escaped in 1838 and became a free man in the North. I was a strong leader and saw and experienced the pain that slaves went through. I wrote a narrative expressing the horror of what it comes with being a slave, and it drew a lot of attention to the problem and gave many an insight as to what actually happened during slavery and on plantations.
My name is Harriet Tubman. I'm Harriet Tubman. I was a slave to about the age of 28. I escaped slavery in 1848. And then I decided to conduct the Underground Railroad. This was a secret system that I organized to get slaves out of the South and start a new identity in the North. About 10 years, I helped over 3,000 slaves using the Underground Railroad. During the Civil War, I worked as a spy for the Union Army, along with other miscellaneous duties during the wartime. One of these included guiding the Combahee River Raid in 1863, which resulted in the liberation of over 700 slaves.
It's loading. Okay, so another leader that we did was Susan B. Anthony, and that's me. So I stood up for not only being a woman, but being a white supporter of the anti-slavery movement. Despite being told that it was improper for women to speak out in public, I made many public speeches on the anti-slavery movement. In 1859, I gave a powerful speech questioning the whites and asking how they would feel if their own kids were working in the fields and receiving brutal treatment. I also felt very strongly that the slave owners had no right to take away the education of the workers. Many say that I had a way of touching people's hearts and gaining support through my heart-spoken and heartfelt words.
I'm William Lloyd Garrison, like I said, and I stood out as an abolition leader because of my white ethnicity, like Susan B. Anthony. And in 1830, after finding out what anti-slavery movement was, I started my own paper called The Liberator. And in following years, I started 2 anti-slavery societies. And I also believed that I believe that I didn't have to take a political stance or party preference. And because of this, I did lose some followers at the time. But despite that, I made a big influence in bringing in slavery, the attention to others.
Okay, next is our solutions to help abolish slavery. One of them is speak up, take part in protest, and make your voice heard. You can take various different actions to do so. This could be everything from singing petitions, making speeches, talking to your peers about the topic, etc. The Liberator was the most. Also, Maria Stewart was a prominent speaker and pamphleteer. What does that say? Okay, so here are some of our solutions to end slavery. The first one is speak up, take part in protests, and make your voice heard. You can take various different actions to do so. This could be everything from signing petitions, making speeches, talking to your peers about the topic, etc.
Some of these examples of people speaking up include The Liberator, which is a very famous anti-slavery newspaper published in Boston, which helped bring a lot of attention to the problem.
Another person that helped was Maria Stewart. She was a prominent speaker and pamphleteer. She was one of the first Black American female political activists to establish a tradition of political activism and freedom to struggle among Black women.
And also another action taken to end slavery was myself publishing my narrative, again, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. And I published this in 1845 in Boston. And this basically launched my public career as most notable Black American spokesman of the 19th century. And it spread awareness to a lot of people and brought attention to the immoral act of slavery. And many actions were taken by people during this time that were not afraid to voice their opinion. And altogether, this brought many people into one unit and had them join the movement.
Yes.
I just messed that up so bad, but it's fine.
So overall, the problem at hand, just to recap, is that during this time, the 19th century, African Americans are put into slavery with harsh and very unfair treatment. The slaves live in large groups on plantations or on small farms in the South and work from sunrise to sunset. Slave owners do punishments such as whip, lash, and even starve their slaves to show dominance or punishment. Many Christian slaveholders defended their actions through the Bible. Slaveholders would use biblical stories such as Paul returning a slave to his master or Abraham having slaves to defend their actions. These owners argue that slavery benefits the African Americans by making them part of the white Christian community. And pictured is an escaped slave named Peter who went to medical examination in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And Baton Rouge, Louisiana in 1863. This is a picture of Peter showing his scars on his back that were caused from his slave owners.
And these are our citations. And then site map. Human trafficking used force, fraud, coercion to obtain some type of labor or sexual act. Millions of men and women and children are trafficked, sold for sexual acts, dehumanized. One person controls the traffics. Victims have a lot of health problems because of inhumane living conditions, poor humanitarian, unsanitary, and etc. And then they're all races. Like all the people are different races. Like it doesn't matter which race you are.
1800 slaveries used force in beating someone for punishment. Use of force in slave does not do if the slave does not do what the master says. Harsh and terrible living conditions. Dehumanized. Slaves have masters. The masters have up to 400 slaves. Slaves are not allowed to read or write or have any opinions at all. Slaves could not read the Bible. They did not know who their family were or even how old some of them were. Only African Americans were used as slaves, and they weren't allowed to have their own opinions.
And then the things they have in common were both were sexually abused, both were beaten, and both involved millions of people. Both were dehumanized. Both have a master, just basically someone that rules over them, and both had bad living conditions that they went through.
And that's like our comparison of like the 1800 slaves and like human trafficking now. It's like, so yeah. This is our propaganda poster, and it says "Break the Chains." And "Break the Chains" like stands for like how slaves were like physically and mentally in chains, and how we wanted like them to like break away from those chains. And then
this is a picture to help represent our slogan, and it just shows a slave's hand tied up in chains, and then it's half blue, half red, and we decided that because they not only have to break physical chains, but they also have to push through mental boundaries and mental chains.
And so then at the bottom of our poster, we just had like the picture of the slave that was beaten and like his back and all of the scars on it. And we just said broken because the slaves were like physically and mentally like broken down. And just like the next picture is just like shows the cruel punishment that they went through in their daily lives is like on the plantations and going through slavery.
Yep. And then that's our propaganda poster.